The world had turned to dust and shadow. What was once a planet teeming with life now lay in ruins, its cities reduced to skeletal husks, silent memorials to a war humanity had never been meant to win. The sky, once vast and open, was choked with the lingering smoke of orbital bombardments, a dark shroud over a people who had refused to vanish. Above, the towering silhouettes of Velethar warships loomed, vast and motionless, like ancient gods watching over their fallen prey. Their presence was a silent decree. Earth belonged to them now. But the war was not over, not yet. The electromagnetic disruption field pulsed in the air, unseen but absolute, a technological guillotine that had severed humanity from its weapons, its satellites, its machines. The age of missiles and drones had ended the moment the Velethar arrived, their biomechanical forms impervious to the crude instruments of war mankind had spent centuries perfecting. Humanity had not fallen in a battle of equals. It had been stripped bare, laid defenseless before an enemy that saw no honor in combat, only extermination. Yet still, they hunted. The survivors, those few who had escaped the first wave, moved like ghosts in the ruins. The Velethar warforms roamed the streets, grotesque amalgamations of metal and flesh, their glowing eyes sweeping through the rubble in search of the last remnants of human resistance. Some survivors scavenged, clinging to the decayed remnants of civilization, whispering rumors of salvation that no longer existed. Others fled, running from one hiding place to another, always a step ahead of the drones that never tired, never stopped. And beneath it all, buried deep in the veins of the dying earth, there were those who still fought. The Velethar did not understand humanity. That was their mistake. They had expected surrender, the same collapse they had seen in 1,000 other species before. They had expected logic, rationality, but humanity did not bend to logic. It was a species of fire and fury, and even in the face of oblivion, it refused to kneel. High in the Appalachian Mountains, where the Velethar's reach was weaker, where the land still held secrets older than the war itself, the resistance stood. Not an army, not anymore, just a fractured collection of ex-soldiers, civilians, and those too stubborn to accept the end. At their center was Elias Rourke, a man who had seen too much death to believe in miracles, but not enough to stop fighting. His second, Sergeant Marco Diaz, moved like a man with nothing to lose, a ghost of war whose only rule was survival at any cost. And then there was Dr. Aisha Patel, the last mind left with the knowledge to challenge the invaders. Not with weapons, but with understanding. The last bastion, as they called it, was more myth than fortress. A crumbling network of underground bunkers patched together with what little remained of human ingenuity. Supplies were running thin, morale thinner, but something else ran through the bones of those who remained, a defiance, raw and unyielding, the sheer refusal to be erased. Then came the fire from the sky. The warning was sudden, a scream from the heavens as the Velethar issued their final decree. A nearby settlement, one of the few left unbroken, erupted in blue plasma fire, its people gone before they could even understand what had happened. From the mountains, the resistance could only watch, helpless as the valley burned, as another piece of their world was reduced to nothing. Aisha worked through the night, the glow of alien transmissions reflected in tired, bloodshot eyes. The message was simple. The Velethar had waited long enough. The extermination would end soon. No more hiding, no more survivors. Earth had been claimed, and those who remained would burn with it. There was no time left. Elias knew what had to be done. This was not a war that could be won through strategy or numbers. The Velethar had stripped them of their weapons, their technology, everything that had once given them an edge in war. But there was one thing they had not accounted for, one thing their logic and precision could never match: humanity's ability to embrace chaos. They expected a clean victory, an efficient purge. They would receive neither. If technology was lost, then fire would take its place. If the war could not be won in the sky, then it would be waged in the dirt, in the forests, in the ruins of the world. The Velithar had reduced humanity to its most primal state, and that would be their undoing. Fire and grit, that was all that was left, and that would be enough. The fight for Earth had only just begun. The bunker was silent, save for the crackling torches lining its stone walls. Shadows danced across the faces of those gathered, a ragged assembly of survivors, fighters, scavengers, those too stubborn to die. Eyes flickered with doubt, fear, and something else buried beneath the exhaustion, hope, or maybe mad. Elias stood before them, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to propose. The war had stripped them of everything: technology, structure, logic. The Velithar had come as gods, reducing Earth's greatest defenses to dust. Humanity's weapons were useless, their tactics irrelevant. But there was one thing left, one thing the Velithar had never encountered in their centuries of conquest: fire. The room shifted. Some muttered in disbelief. Others clenched their fists, as if daring someone to tell them it was impossible. But Elias spoke with certainty, cutting through their uncertainty like steel through bone. The Velithar expected a war of precision, efficiency, and cold calculation. They would get none of it. Instead, they would face chaos. They would face a species that had spent millennia mastering destruction with nothing but raw ingenuity. Skepticism burned away as Elias's final words rang through the cavernous space, sealing their fate with the weight of an undeniable truth. If fire is all we have, then we make it burn the heavens. They moved like ghosts through the ruins, scavenging for materials that had once been relics of an age long past. Oil barrels, resin-coated cloth, broken bottles filled with accelerants. What had once been dismissed as primitive now became their salvation. They hollowed out pits, lined them with sharpened stakes, filled them with fire traps. Molten tar and stolen gasoline would become their new artillery. They studied old battlefields, how fire had turned tides in wars long forgotten. The burning of ships, the siege of cities, the terror of flame when it could not be controlled. The Velithar were creatures of order. They would not expect a war fought in the dirt, in the smoke, in the choking heat of an inferno they could not escape. The first battle came swift and brutal. The Velithar patrol advanced through the ruins, their war forms moving with unnatural precision, scanning for human signatures. Their glowing eyes cast pale illumination on the shattered streets, their metal limbs clicking softly against the debris. Then, the firebomb struck. The street erupted in a wave of heat and light, liquid fire racing through the cracks in the pavement, swallowing the war form in an instant. The shriek that followed was not mechanical. It was something deeper, something primal. The creature recoiled, flailing against the flames as its body twisted and convulsed. The humans did not hesitate. Spears, sharpened metal, burning arrows. Every weapon once deemed obsolete found its mark. The warform collapsed, twitching in a pool of molten wreckage. For the first time, the Velithar had been defeated in direct combat. And for the first time, humanity understood that they could win. The air had barely settled before the retaliation came. From the sky, the second wave descended, reinforcements swift and unrelenting. The survivors scattered, melting into the ruins as the Velithar unleashed their fury. But no matter how advanced their scanners, no matter how precise their movements, they were searching for an enemy that had already disappeared. The battlefield was empty, save for the smoldering wreckage of their own kind. Inside the Velithar warship, the High Command analyzed the footage in silence. Their kind had conquered countless civilizations, reducing them to submission through sheer technological superiority. None had resisted past the first extermination wave. None had refused to die. The humans did not fight like the others. They did not engage in direct combat, nor did they attempt surrender. Their tactics defied logic, embracing destruction not as a means to an end, but as a principle of war itself. For the first time in Velithar history, an enemy had fought back in ways that could not be anticipated. A new directive was issued. The extermination would no longer be systematic, it would be absolute. Across the world, the final purge began. Warforms marched through forests, igniting everything in their path. Hidden bunkers were bombed, flooded, collapsed. Cities once believed to be safe crumbled under the weight of precision strikes. Every last trace of human defiance would be erased. The resistance dwindled, but they did not break. Every strike, every massacre, every calculated act of destruction only fueled the fire burning in the hearts of those who remained. Aisha worked tirelessly, poring over the remains of a fallen warform, seeking an answer in the ruin of its broken frame. The Velithar were beyond human technology, their bodies a fusion of organic and synthetic materials. Their systems operating on principles Earth's greatest minds had barely begun to understand. But there was something they had missed. Fire had not simply damaged the warform. It had destroyed its core, unraveling its ability to regenerate, to function. The Velithar had integrated organic components into their machines, making them stronger, faster, adaptive. But it had also made them vulnerable. Their warforms did not just burn, they feared the fire, recoiling from its touch as if it were poison. Their bodies were not designed to withstand uncontrolled combustion. Fire was not just a weapon, it was their weakness. Elias absorbed the revelation with the cold clarity of a soldier staring at a blade he had just unsheathed. This was no longer about survival. This was no longer a desperate struggle against an unstoppable force. This was a war, and for the first time since the Velithar arrived, humanity was not losing. The war had become something else. What began as extermination had twisted into something the Velithar had never encountered. An enemy that refused to accept defeat, that turned its own destruction into a weapon. Where technology had failed, fire had risen, an ancient force repurposed for the battlefield of the damned. Across the ruined world, survivors toiled like blacksmiths in the forge of desperation. They crafted war from the remnants of their fallen civilization, blending ingenuity with brutality. Crude oil siphoned from rusted pipelines, sulfur harvested from decayed industrial zones, resin and tar mixed into burning death. What was once chemical waste became liquid fire, packed into glass bottles, crude shells, and oil-drenched rags. This was not war as the Velithar understood it. It was chaos. From the ashes of fallen cities, humanity built its last stand. Ruins no longer served as tombs for the past, but as traps, death-laden corridors where fuel caches lay hidden beneath rubble, waiting for the first misstep. The Velithar marched forward, confident in their might, only to find the ground itself turning against them. Streets erupted in firestorms. Underground tunnels collapsed in deafening blasts. Entire structures fell as fire devoured their insides. Their warforms, designed for efficiency, found themselves ensnared in unpredictability. They adapted quickly to countermeasures, but adaptation required time, and humanity had learned to deny them that luxury. When fire claimed a warform, it did not just burn. It consumed, searing through their organic cores, reducing their advanced systems to nothing more than molten wreckage. Forests, once natural sanctuaries, became hunting grounds of smoke and flame. The resistance twisted nature itself into a battlefield, using controlled burns to herd the Velithar into corridors of destruction. Fuel lines detonated in cascading infernos. Industrial plants were turned into bombs the size of city blocks. The Velithar had waged war against technology, but what they faced now was something older, something more relentless. There was no battlefield. The world itself had become the weapon. They learned fire was not the only enemy. Smoke drowned them, choking the air in thick clouds of poison. Their senses, so accustomed to reading heat signatures, were rendered blind by the blazes that stretched for miles. When they staggered through the suffocating blackness, they found themselves surrounded, not by soldiers with rifles, but by warriors wielding fire-hardened spears, molten tar grenades, and weapons crafted from the bones of their own dead. The resistance fought without mercy, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. They had seen their homes burned, their families erased, their children hunted. The old rules of war had no place here. The only rule was survival. Entire landscapes were sacrificed to deny the Velitar their conquest. Cities were abandoned, their streets turned into raging infernos. There were no civilians anymore, only the living and the soon-to-be dead. Not all agreed with the choices being made. The fire that consumed the Velithar also consumed humanity. Among the resistance, fractures grew. Those who wished to hold on to what remained of their morality, and those who knew morality was a burden the dead carried to their graves. Some argued that it was time to surrender, that Earth was already lost and fighting would only prolong the inevitable. But others, those who had stared into the abyss of annihilation, knew surrender was never an option. The Velithar did not take prisoners. There would be no slavery, no subjugation. There would only be silence. And so they burned everything. The Velithar struggled to comprehend it. High Command reviewed every engagement, searching for patterns, searching for logic. It was not there. This war did not follow strategy or calculated efficiency. Humanity fought like a species with nothing left to lose, with rage, desperation, and an unwillingness to accept reality. Their commanders stood in stunned silence as they watched entire legions lost to fire traps set by an enemy that should have been eradicated long ago. No civilization had ever resisted the Velithar for this long. No species had refused to break, even as their world crumbled beneath them. Something primal flickered through the Velithar ranks. Not frustration, not anger, fear. The great conquerors, the architects of planetary extinction, were beginning to understand a truth they had never needed to consider. They had expected conquest, but this was no longer a war of domination. It was a war of survival. And for the first time in their long history, they were the ones who might not survive. ChatGPT said, ChatGPT, the plan was madness. It was desperation given form. A strategy born not from logic, but from the sheer refusal to die quietly. There was no victory left to claim, no world to reclaim. The only thing humanity had left was the ability to decide how the war ended, and it would not end on its knees. Elias stood among his commanders, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by months of unrelenting war. There was no room for doubt. The Velithar were preparing their final strike, the extermination wave that would scour the last embers of human resistance from existence. But they had underestimated their prey. Earth itself would become the trap. Every last drop of fuel, every remaining pipeline, every forest that still stood, it would all burn. The planet would be made uninhabitable, reduced to an inferno that no warform, no command ship, no empire could withstand. If humanity fell, they would take their executioners with them. The Velithar would not walk away from this war unscathed. They would carry the scars of Earth's defiance across the stars, and they would remember. There was no time left. The fire had to be lit. The walls of the Velithar fortress pulsed with a sickly, biomechanical glow, the air thick with the scent of something not quite living, not quite dead. The strike team moved in silence, navigating the labyrinthine corridors, each step a battle against the primal instinct to run. There was no room for error. The compounds they carried, stolen explosives, makeshift incendiaries, were crude, but devastating. Aisha worked swiftly, her hands steady even as her mind screamed. The alien systems were beyond human comprehension, an intricate web of logic that had crushed 1,000 civilizations before Earth. But this was her battlefield, and she carved through their defenses like a blade through flesh. Marco and his fighters worked with quiet efficiency, planting charges along the veins of the fortress. Every step forward was another knife in the Velethar war machine, another blow against the gods who had believed themselves untouchable. The first alarm shattered the silence, then the second. The fortress woke, the walls pulsing, the drones stirring. The escape was not clean, nor was it meant to be. They did not need to get out unseen. They only needed to make it out before the inferno consumed everything. Across the globe, the flames began to rise. The sky turned crimson, the air choked with the scent of burning oil, burning forests, burning cities. Controlled detonations rippled through the wastelands, each explosion feeding the next, until the world itself roared in defiance. The Velethar warforms faltered. Their movements, once perfect, now lagged, their systems struggling against the unrelenting heat. Fire licked at their biomechanical limbs, their organic components shriveling, melting, blackening. The purge had turned on its masters. From the wreckage, humanity emerged, not as victims, but as executioners. They fought with scavenged weapons, with sharpened steel and fire-tipped arrows, with a brutality the Velethar had never encountered. Technology had failed, but instinct endured. Into the light, system, Thomas said. The invincible warriors of the Velethar Empire were now prey, their towering warforms reduced to smoldering wreckage. They had come to exterminate, to cleanse, to crush. Instead, they burned. And in the center of it all, the last battle awaited. The Velethar Supreme Commander descended like a god of war, its form gleaming in the firelight. A monstrosity of engineered perfection, a being sculpted for domination. It did not hesitate, it did not question. It was designed for one purpose, to end this war with a single, merciless strike. Elias did not run. Blooded, broken, held together by willpower alone, he stood his ground. There was no hesitation, no thought of retreat. This was how it had to be. The fight was not elegant, it was not precise. It was raw, brutal, and merciless. The Velethar was faster, stronger, built for war in ways no human could ever match. But Elias fought like an animal, with the rage of an entire species boiling in his veins. He did not fight clean, he fought to win. Every strike was met with another, every wound ignored, every weakness exploited with a predator's instinct. The Velethar moved with calculated precision. Elias moved with the desperate fury of a species that refused to be erased. The final blow came with fire. A sword, its steel broken, its edge ruined, but its purpose clear, plunged into the Velethar's core. And with it, the Supreme Commander burned. Above, the sky cracked. The command ship, the monolithic heart of the Velethar invasion, trembled under the weight of the inferno. The flames had consumed the world, and now they reached for the heavens. The fleet began to break. The Velethar had come to conquer, they had come to erase, but now, one by one, their ships lifted away from the dying world, retreating into the void. Earth was not theirs. Not now, not ever. The war was over, but the world was unrecognizable. The land was scorched, the air thick with the remnants of battle. Thousands lay dead, civilization reduced to ruins. But in the ashes, something remained. Survivors. Not many, not enough, but enough to know that humanity had done the impossible. They had won, and the Velethar would never forget. The future was uncertain. The Earth was wounded beyond repair, but it was still theirs. From the wreckage, they would rebuild. From the fire, something new would rise. In the silence that followed, A transmission echoed from deep space. You were not meant to win. Others are watching. The war was over. But humanity's story had only just begun. ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. The silence was unnatural. Not the quiet of peace, but the stillness that follows devastation, when the air itself seems to mourn the ruin left behind. Fire still smoldered in the wreckage, their dying embers painting streaks of crimson against the sky, where ash drifted like snow. The once proud Velithar war machines lay shattered, their twisted metal carcasses half buried in scorched earth. They had come as gods, they now remained as corpses. Survivors moved through the ruins, cautious, their steps slow, uncertain. Victory had been won, but at what cost? The weight of what had been endured pressed against every breath, every heartbeat. No cheers filled the air, no cries of triumph. They had fought for their survival, and they had won, but no one felt like celebrating. The battlefield stretched for miles in all directions, a graveyard for both human and alien alike. But unlike the Velithar, humanity still stood. The cost of defiance was written in blood and fire. Cities had been reduced to nothing but blackened husks, entire landscapes carved apart by the unrelenting destruction that had engulfed them. Thousands had died, not just in battle, but in the infernos set to deny the enemy their victory. Elias walked through the devastation, his boots crunching over debris and bone. The victory felt hollow. He had spent so long fighting to stop the inevitable that he had not considered what winning might look like. This was not triumph. This was survival at a terrible price. The Velithar had been driven back, their ships fleeing like carrion birds from a dying beast, but the war had carved something out of the survivors. They were not the same people who had once dreamed of peace. They had become something harder, something fiercer, a species tempered in war, reforged in fire. And it was unclear if that was something to be feared or embraced. The question lingered. What came next? The war was over, but survival alone was not enough. The earth lay in ruin, its infrastructure shattered, its resources dwindling. Aisha knew that humanity could not live in the ashes forever. They had to build again, not just endure. Yet she saw the hesitation in the faces around her, the weariness of those who had given everything just to live another day. There was no government left, no industry, no global communication. There was only a handful of scattered survivors on a planet that had been deemed uninhabitable, even by the enemy. They had fought to keep their world, and now they had to decide if it was still worth having. The choice was simple in theory: rebuild or prepare for the next war. The Velithar had fled, but they had not been defeated. They would remember. They would return. Perhaps not today, perhaps not in a decade, but eventually the stars would darken once more with the shadow of their ships, and humanity would be ready. The war had reshaped them. Once they had been explorers, dreamers, a species that had looked to the stars with awe and wonder. Now, they looked to the sky with something else. Readiness. Elias knew it too well. He had led soldiers, not settlers. He had trained killers, not craftsmen. And now he stood in the ruins of a war they had won, knowing that peace might never truly return. There had been no negotiations, no surrender. The Velithar had never once seen them as equals, only as vermin to be exterminated. But vermin had teeth. Were they still the same species that had sent scientists and poets beyond the stars? Or had war defined them forever? Had they proven their strength at the cost of their humanity? And if they had, did it even matter? In the distance, the last Velithar warships faded into the void. There was no final message, no parting threat, but the meaning was clear. They would be back. They would not forget what had happened here. Humanity had been underestimated, written off as another footnote in the long history of Velithar conquest. But that had been a mistake, one the aliens would carry with them long after the fires of Earth had gone cold. A transmission crackled through the remnants of Earth's ruined communication networks. A signal from deep space, distorted and ancient. You were not meant to win, others are watching. The survivors gathered, hearing the message, feeling the weight of it settle into their bones. The Velithar had not fought alone. They never had. The war was over, but the fight had only just begun. The sky was empty now, stripped of the towering warships that had once loomed above like harbingers of extinction. The Velithar were gone, retreating beyond the stars, but they had not left in silence. Scattered among the ruins, nestled between the scorched remains of their war machines, something remained. The artifact stood among the wreckage, vast and unbroken. It was neither metal nor stone, neither dead nor alive. Its surface pulsed faintly, shifting as if it were breathing, as if it were waiting. Twisted spires of unknown alloy jutted from its form, entwined with veins of something darker, something organic. It had not been left by accident. Survivors gathered at its base, staring, whispering. Was it a relic of Velithar conquest? A final insult? Or was it something else? Something left behind not by the enemy, but by something greater. Aisha traced her fingers over the strange carvings embedded in its structure, her breath catching as she recognized the truth. The symbols were not Velithar. The language was older, more intricate, woven with meaning she could not yet grasp. This was no trophy. It was no warning. It was a message. A distant transmission crackled to life, the last dying gasp of a ruined satellite that should have been long dead. The signal surged across fractured networks, a whisper carried through the endless dark. It was not random. It was not interference. The words came slowly, distorted by distance, but unmistakable in their intent. You were not meant to win. Others are watching. A silence settled over the survivors, deeper than the void itself. The war had never been just about Earth. The Velithar had not fought alone, and they had not fought without reason. If they had come as conquerors, then why had they fled? And if they had fled, then from what? Elias stood among his people, the weight of victory pressing heavier than the burden of war. They had done the impossible, they had survived, but the universe had taken notice. The Velithar were not the first to see humanity as a threat. They would not be the last. The fires of war had burned out, but beyond the ruins, beyond the broken sky, something was watching. Something was coming. And so we end, and so we begin.